Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. On April 6, 1994, the Rwanda genocide began. Over the next 100 days, 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutus were massacred in an unparalleled modern-day slaughter. How does a nation pick up the pieces after the killing is stopped? On June 7, 1998, three white men in Jasper, Texas, chained James Byrd Jr. to the bumper of a truck and dragged him to his death. Within 24 hours, Sheriff Billy Rolls, who believed justice was colorblind, charged the killers with murder. How did this Piney Woods, Texas town earn hard-won resurrection and redemption in the wake of an unholy crime? To talk about murder, redemption, the media, and memory in Rwanda and Texas is Dina Temple-Raston, currently the City Hall Bureau Chief of the New York Sun. She has worked as a foreign correspondent in China and Hong Kong and covered the White House for Bloomberg Business News. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Let's start with the latest book. In fact, just recently released, Justice on the Grass, three Rwandan journalists, their trial for war crimes, and a nation's quest for redemption. Before we get to the story, how did you come to the story? What motivated you to look at Rwanda, and particularly look at it in terms of this media trial?
Well, it actually started with the first book. I was looking at the way white on black racism actually occurred in Texas. And as that sort of unraveled, I wondered, would it be different if you had black on black racism? Okay. And what would the differences be? And so I tend to sort of get these ideas for books and then jump on a plane and just go. So I ran to Rwanda, and I went to Rwanda, and basically I found myself with this film crew in the middle of this banana grove with 4 surviving Tutsi from a village where there had previously been about 500 Tutsi. And they were all Tutsi out of central casting, tall and thin and cream-colored. And so I asked them a question, well, you know, how did you get along with Hutu before the genocide? And this one named Clavier turned to me and said, oh, well, I guess we got along with them all right, but, you know, we always knew they were prejudiced. And what was amazing about that moment, and most writers will tell you there's a moment where they realize they have a book, is that was word for word what a black in Jasper had told me when I was writing the book.
So there was real resonance across the continent.
Well, you know, same vocabulary, same ideas, same feeling when you're the recipient of prejudice. I mean, it was fascinating to me.
Okay, tell us the Rwandan story as it unfolded to you.
Well, what I decided to do is, because most publishers will tell you people don't care about Africa books. So you can't just write a book about Africa. You have to find some sort of resonating theme that Americans would find interesting. And for me, I had read an article about these 3 journalists who ran Radio Mille Collines, or RTLM, in Rwanda during the genocide. And most people know this as Radio Hate. And it was a radio station in which they called for Tutsi to be, you know, exterminated, told people where Tutsi were going.
Called them cockroaches.
Called them cockroaches, which has sort of a double meaning in Rwanda. But, I mean, it sounds awful to us, but in fact, it went back to sort of a time when rebel soldiers who were Tutsi could come into Rwanda under cover of darkness, do something, and slip out again.
Okay.
So that, I mean, it originally was not such a terrible term as we would find it in the United States, but later, you know, came to be known for these rebels.
So anyway, it's this trial of these. It's the trial
of these three journalists, and the reason why I found it interesting is what I found out was that the last time that an international court really looked at this whole issue of freedom of the press and whether they should put limits on press freedom was during Nuremberg, when Julius Streicher, the #1 Nazi, was sent to the gallows for what he wrote in Der Stürmer. And it seemed to me that over 50 years, the media has really, really changed. And to actually take a look at how a court would deal with the media now versus how they dealt with it before, I thought would make a very interesting book.
Surprises to you as a member of the media. What struck you most about this case?
Well, I think what struck me most about it was that in the end, these three guys are found guilty of incitement to genocide and crimes against humanity. But a lot of what was said on the radio station is not all that much worse than what are in cop-killing rap lyrics, or with the exception of actually calling somebody's name and saying to go out and kill them, certainly. But a lot of the stuff that they were found guilty of, incitement, is not that much worse than talk radio. So if you're going to have an international court put these parameters that are very un-American parameters on freedom of speech or protected speech, how is that going to translate to the way the media sort of is allowed to conduct its business going forward?
Okay. And I got a sense from reading this book, and I have not read any reviews on the book, that you were not totally in favor of the guilty verdict of the three men who were charged with this incitement, this media incitement to genocide. Right.
I guess I would nuance it just a little bit more than that and say that I think the three guys, the three journalists, and their names were Ferdinand Nahimana, Jean Bosco Barayagwiza, which takes time to learn how to say, and Hassan Ngezi.
I did it by two letters,
yeah,
right?
You
right.
chunk it out. That's how you basically get it. And anyway, they were found guilty of essentially everything that they were accused of: incitement to genocide, crimes against humanity, murder, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is that it was very tangential, the way that they were linked to the radio station. And their defense was that April 6th, the plane goes down, President Habyarimana is killed, this sparks the genocide. And from that moment onward, according to their defense, they really didn't have a role in the radio station because the army took it over. Now, during a coup, it is not a big leap to think that the army might have taken over the radio station.
So you're not convinced that they were, but you're looking at this as an American, aren't you, with American media values?
Yes, so certainly. And so I have the value that everyone gets to speak and you filter it out. And that's the values that we've grown up with in the media here. But increasingly, for example, in Europe, it's not that way. And the actual verdict really depended upon some sort of scary precedents. And I should also say just quickly that the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda is setting precedent for the International Criminal Court.
And ultimately that International Criminal Court, should we become a member, would affect American journalists as well as any signatories journalists.
And you're also looking at a case in which we know that Radio Mille Collines was a really bad radio station. We know it did things you're not supposed to do as a radio station. But it set the precedent for what the ICC is going to look at in terms of media law.
And you, I got the sense that you feel that this is an unhealthy precedent. How is it unhealthy?
Well, among other things, generally the way we think of press freedom or protected speech in America is we have something called causation. And I'm not a lawyer, but this is sort of the legal argument behind it. That something is said, and then you have to show a link to an action that happened afterwards. Well, because of this particular precedent, and because they couldn't link what these three guys actually said, since they were rarely on the radio, with something that happened later, they had to draw out the idea of causation. So now you don't need this direct link. You kind of need just a tangential link. That's frightening. Another thing that we talk about is there's a sliding scale now of press freedom, if this sets the precedent for international law. And by that it means that actually in the verdict they said if you are a journalist who is taking the government line, you have less protected speech than if you are a journalist who is taking the opposite line, which is just stunning when you think about it. And they use as a precedent China and Vietnam, two of our great bastions of free press. So this is why I have problems with the actual verdict. And when this case was taken up, many free press advocates were worried that the judgment would end up being drawn in a very broad way so that it could apply to a lot. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why I have some concerns about it.
going back to Rwanda, what was the most striking, as an American, what was the most striking element of culture shock for you in this case, other than just the massive amount of murder?
Well, I don't know that you could say it was just other than the massive amount of murder, because essentially everyone in Rwanda was affected. Let's say, for example, you're not Tutsi.
We're talking about a relatively small, landlocked country.
Right, the size of Maryland.
Okay.
Okay, and the most crowded nation in Africa. So you've got a real competition for resources. Okay, and just to clarify, Tutsi, the way you can tell them apart, in general, Tutsi are tall and Hutu are sort of hydrant-shaped. And that's how you can sort of remember which is which. But even if you lost all your family, if you were Tutsi and you lost everyone in your family, you could actually ruin the family of a Hutu by simply pointing them out and saying, I'm pretty sure they were involved with the killing. And what happened is 120,000 Hutu were summarily carted off to prison in the months after the genocide with no trial, no proof, merely someone who pointed you out.
Now, just to explain the history, a Tutsi force then took over the state of Rwanda and reestablished Tutsi rule. Is that not the case?
That I'm sure that's not how they would characterize it, but that is indeed the case.
And in fact, as you seem to indicate, that the Hutu fears of a Tutsi regime seem to be taking place at this very moment.
They were well-founded. I mean, the example I always use with friends is sort of a high school example, which is, if you remember in David Copperfield, sort of towards the end, you suddenly realize that the main character in David Copperfield has turned into his wicked stepfather, Murdstone.
Right.
And some people maybe figured that out in the beginning, but I didn't figure out until 3/4 of the way through. And I think that's sort of what's happened in Rwanda, is that what you have now there, you clearly had a strongman who was there before, a Hutu strongman, Habyarimana, who was killed, which started the genocide. Then it was taken over by this Tutsi rebel army. And you clearly have a strongman in Paul Kagame, who is he's Tutsi, he's the president, he was the head of the rebel forces, he's risen to power, he had an election a couple of years ago, and oh, what a surprise, won by 98.7%. I was actually in his campaign van during, part of this campaign, and I was also in Twagiramungu, who was a Hutu guy, who was also running against him, and saw Kagame's goons come and break up, Twagiramungu's rallies. I mean, this is not real democracy that we see here. And let me just say that essentially what's happened is that you had a Hutu strongman before, and really what you have is a Tutsi strongman now. So all that's changed is that it's the mirror image of what it used to be.
And it seems, as you leave off this book, I guess in the summer of 2004, this could happen again in the same place. It seems that are there strong enough revulsions to prevent this from happening again?
Absolutely
or is
not.
it so tenuous that it could happen again?
Well, a lot of what set the basis for the genocide, most people think the genocide in 94 was in fact the first genocide in Rwanda. It was more like the fifth. But we noticed it because it was so big.
And we ignored it for a long time, we meaning the West and the United States.
Absolutely. We ignored it as long as we could get away with ignoring it. Be that as it may, you have a population of Hutu who are still 85% of the country, and the Tutsi who are now ruling, who are 15% of the country. And if you talk to any Hutu in Rwanda, they'll go to the tourism office. Who's behind the desk? It's the Tutsi. Go over here to the airline office. Who's behind the desk? It's the Tutsi. The Tutsi get all the best jobs. And there's a tremendous amount of bitterness that's bubbling under the surface. 85% of the country is not going to take this forever. And the fact that they're so willing to talk about how angry they are about the Tutsi, and that everything that the radio station RTLM had warned them about, that if we let the Tutsi get any sort of power, they're going to take over and we'll be second-class citizens again. Well, it's exactly what happened.
How does a nation that's presumably an overwhelmingly Roman Catholic Christian, on the shooting down of an airplane, even though you pointed out that there's precedent to it, how do tens of thousands of people become murderers? Almost like that. What is there any explanation to it?
It's funny, a friend of mine read the book and said he wanted a really easy answer, and he was a little bummed out that he finished the whole book and I didn't give them an easy answer.
No, and I'm not bummed out about it. I know there's no easy answer, but inklings, what, other than history and this belief that in some way these people are different and in some way not human or not as human as we are?
No, it's not that. In fact, I can bring together again sort of the Jasper experience and the Rwanda experience in this. And I think it gets down to when you feel you have nothing left, you have nothing to lose, then you make some really bad decisions because you have nothing to lose for that bad decision. In the case of Jasper, you had 3 unemployed guys who basically saw nothing really happening for them in the future. And they decided that they would take this black man and beat him up in the woods and then drag him to death because, frankly, why not? They had nothing to lose. They had no jobs. They were out drinking on a Saturday night. Same thing happens in Rwanda. I mean, for the Hutu to kill the Tutsi, the prospect was that they were going to wipe out that entire section of Rwandan population. And then they'd have their land, they'd have their houses, they'd have their jobs.
So it's economic and political more than racial. I mean, I looked at this, trying to put it in American terms. You know, it was ethnicity versus ethnicity, and that's the way I sort of understood it prior to reading this book. But it's not even that. If that were a justification, which it's not, it's not even that. While in the Jasper, it's clearly a question of race. But again, let's go to Jasper. Mm-hmm. The role of history and memory in terms of the unfolding of this particular situation, what led to the murder and the aftermath of the murder, and the media's role in that situation. Parallels with Rwanda, different, lessons learned?
Different. I mean, in both cases, I'm looking at what roles the media plays. And in the Jasper case, the role the media played is the media essentially pushed people in Jasper to put on their best face. And let me back up a little bit and say that when I started the Jasper book,
let's go back a little bit more.
Okay.
Why the Jasper book? What were you doing at the time, and why did you go to Jasper?
Well, I was the White House correspondent for Bloomberg News at that time.
Okay.
And about the same time that the James Byrd murder happened, Monica Lewinsky was at a crescendo in terms of the story.
Okay.
And as a journalist, Monica Lewinsky was kind of a very depressing story to cover. A lot of the journalistic ethics that we're used to, second sourcing with somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight, were really pretty much thrown out. I mean, I had the blue dress, clue. So did everyone else. Everyone got it from the same place. They got it from Linda Tripp. Mm-hmm. Everybody went with it, even though Linda Tripp had a dog in that fight. I didn't go with it, but that was for other reasons. But basically, it was bad journalism. So then I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about how this little town in Texas had experienced this terrible murder and was bending over backward. The whole white community was bending over backwards to make amends for it. So I read the article and I thought, okay, either this is the world's greatest story with heart, or this is an absolute lie. And either way, it's a great story.
Okay, so you get permission to go to Jasper, Texas.
Yeah, I actually took a long weekend, grabbed a ticket, drove down to Jasper, and talked to everybody who was in the article, and then some, because it was a very small town, very easy to get around. And so that's how I came to that book. And then the more and more I talked to people, the more and more I realized that they were sort of talking from the same script. But this is like this small, deep East Texas town, so why would everybody be saying the same thing? And what's interesting is that...
Well, what were they saying that was similar?
Well, but I mean, using the same vocabulary. Oh, well, maybe we haven't always been as enlightened as we should be. Oh, well, I guess we all got along all right, but we've got a couple of bad apples. But I mean, they were saying not just similar things, they were saying identical things. And for someone who is a White House correspondent, who is in the process of being spun with the Monica Lewinsky story, I went, oh my God, these guys are spinning.
Okay. Why were they spinning, and have they been successful? And was the spinning good?
Well, the idea was that someone had obviously coached the people of Jasper and said, look, we've had this terrible murder, the worst murder, racially motivated murder since Emmett Till. Everybody's going to come down here. CNN's going to be down here. And if you don't want them to rip apart our small, sleepy town, then everybody needs to be on message. And so everyone was. And so the media sort of lapped it up. And frankly, I would have lapped it up too if, as most journalists are, you could parachute in for the story and then you leave. Well, what I wanted to see is if you don't just parachute in, if you stay, what happens?
What happened?
Well, the story started falling apart. There started to be use of the N-word all of a sudden, you know, in front of me. And there were, oh, the blacks always think they're so put upon in Jasper, and the truth is, you know, they're just lazy, and that's why they don't have the work. And all those sort of deep South stuff that you hear as a Northerner, deep South civil rights stuff,
right,
was all coming up. And what was even more interesting is I thought it was going to be this book about how this town had, you know, come to a reckoning and redeemed itself after this terrible murder. And then the Bill King, who was one of the three,
right,
who was a killer, when Bill King's trial was over, it was like Jasper was saying, okay, that's it. We put one of our own away. He's going to be sentenced to death. The town no longer is to blame because we didn't let him get away with it. And then they reverted back to type.
But this sounds fairly similar to the situation in Rwanda. There's another parallel here, it seems.
Sure. There are tons of parallels.
Talk about the media parallel here. What else is going on with the media here?
Well, the media is driving the story. I mean, that's where there are similarities. I mean, in the Jasper case, I don't feel that it was the media making things worse. Whereas clearly in the Rwanda book, they were RTLM was making things worse. But in both books, I really am looking at various angles of the power of the media. And in the Jasper book, I'm looking at how the media crafted a story that America thought it knew, and in fact didn't know.
So it's creating an acceptable narrative for the American public.
That's right.
But is there that narrative here in Rwanda? Or is it an unfinished narrative?
It's unfinished. It's unfinished. And also, you know, I don't want to completely give away the book, but in the end of the book, there's a new radio station that started.
Right.
And the new radio station that started is a private radio station, just like RTLM was. And it started with 3 weeks of nothing but music, just like RTLM did, to get people to listen. And this time it's run by a Tutsi. So
it's deja vu all over again?
Mirror image.
One of the scenes in Hotel Rwanda very early on is when the reporter shows this film of the massacre and believes that this is going to send a message to the world and they're going to react. And the response was, nothing's going to happen. They're just going to sit down and eat dinner.
Right.
Are we seeing the same thing in the Sudan? Are we reliving the same mistakes that were made by the United States and the West? There doesn't seem to be any learning here, given my, relatively uninformed position here. But what's your sense of this?
I was in Sudan in May. And
oh, you were?
Yeah, I was the first journalist into the rebel camps in May, and I was there for the New York Sun. And one of the reasons why they sent me is because there was a sense that there were a lot of parallels between what had happened in Rwanda and what was going on in Darfur. And I wrote a really long article about how the government in Khartoum was actually stealing plays out of the Rwandan government playbook, saying, "Oh yeah, it's rebels. We don't know how to control them." Just as Rwandans said, "We don't know how to control the Interahamwe, the militia that's killing all the Tutsi." And there's sort of a moving of the goalposts. Oh yeah, well, we'll take care of those people. Yeah, we'll really sort of crack down on them. Or, the Rwandans said that they had no control over the Interahamwe, yet they armed them. Mm-hmm. Same way that the government in Khartoum says it has no control over the Janjaweed, which are those armed Arab horsemen who are killing a lot of the black Africans in West Darfur. And yet they have helicopter cover. And they have, Janjaweed, nomadic horsemen don't have helicopters.
Okay.
It's a pretty simple
connection between that and the government.
Yeah, exactly.
Why? Powell used the term genocide.
And then backed away from it.
And backed away from it.
UN used the word, then backed away from it.
Again, why?
Well,
They're just Africans?
no, well, first of all, using the word genocide is an even more loaded word than just using it.
Go ahead.
Because there's an entire sort of number of actions you have to take legally once a genocide is actually identified. That's by the Geneva Convention. You have to do it. So that's why everybody's so dicey about using the word genocide, because it makes them have to do something. That's part of it. I mean, in a sense, I feel like we did more in Darfur sooner than we did in Rwanda, in the sense that the Darfur killing is sort of a drip, drip, drip killing. I mean,
Right.
there are like 40,000 people dead, but this is over
A much longer period of time.
a couple of years.
Okay.
Whereas in Rwanda, it was 100 days, 800,000 people, which is sort of a mind-boggling number when you think about it. I mean, there was somebody I interviewed that said that it took 2 years for the Nazis to sort of set up their whole, genocide Holocaust, and Rwanda was able to do the 4 stages that the Nazis did in like a matter of weeks instead of a matter of
Well, you
years.
had it seemed the whole population involved with the genocide in Rwanda. What's the next book?
The next book on my Death and Destruction trilogy, which seems to be what attracts me. I'm looking a little bit at religious intolerance. In particular, I haven't thought it completely through yet, but it jumps off the Theo van Gogh murder in Amsterdam.
Okay.
And essentially it takes a look at Islamic extremism, how it rises up in a society that's theoretically as tolerant as the Dutch society is, and how the Theo van Gogh murders actually sort of knocked Europe off its sort of equilibrium.
And it's very much off its equilibrium. I am very good friends with several people in the Netherlands, old dear friends, and they are somewhat at sea and traumatized by that event. We don't have any more time. We didn't even get into New York City politics and media use, so you have to come back. But we will talk about that as well. Thank you.